Hello friends, my name is JJ, and today we are going to do a deeper dive into the topic of generations based on some reactions I got to the video I posted on this topic last week. Now, I will be honest with you, I almost didn't post that video at all because as I was editing it, I really started to feel like the topic of generations just wasn't that interesting and wouldn't provoke much of a response from you guys, but I was wrong. As it turns out, the whole business of seeking to understand how we are culturally shaped by the era in which we are born is something that a lot of you find very interesting indeed. My video provoked a lot of very fascinating and insightful comments, which is what we will be going over today. So let me start out with an email I got from my friend Hamish. He noted that many people believe that this whole idea of discrete generational categories, the boomers, the zoomers, the millennials, and so on, is largely a result of the severe culture clash that occurred in the West between people born before and after the Second World War. As Hamish writes, the argument is that young people in the 1910s weren't so different in mores and opinions from young people in the 1870s or 1880s, but the baby boomers were so different from how their parents had been when they were young, the idea of boomers had to be created. And because this one generation was so different and named, now we name all the generations and exaggerate their differences. I think Hamish is right, and I would just add that we should remember that the initial way people talked about this phenomenon was through the concept of a so-called generation gap between the culture of boomers and their parents. You can see on this Google trend chart that generation gap was not really a concept that anybody talked about before the 1960s, but became this huge thing immediately after. I mean, check this out. It's a wrapper of a pack of Generation Gap brand gum from the 1960s, and on the top we have this couple dancing in a sort of early 20th century Lindy Hop style, and then below them we've got some boomers in their wild 60s fashion dancing the go-go. This gets to another insight that Hamish shared, which is the enormous role that new styles of post-war music played in building up this idea of the generation gap. While there was always popular music, I'm not sure if there was ever specifically young people's music before rock. Like even jazz in the 20s, it was seen as new and different, but it wasn't specifically young people's music. And before that, everyone listened to music hall or vaudeville or whatever. But as far as I know, that cleave on music was class-based and not generational. So when someone like me talks about generations, we tend to use the conventional American understanding of the idea. But as I noted in the first video, different countries often have distinct methods of generational sorting that are all their own. My friend Anton from Russia, for example, shares a very detailed description of how generations are understood over there. In Russia, a lot of generations are usually split by the dictators who were at the helm of the country when they were born. I'm part of the Putin generation, born in 2003. My older brother was part of the Yeltsin/90s generation, born in 1988. And my mom is part of the Brezhnev generation, born in 1968. My generation is known as the one that's good with gizmos and has no respect for the fallen in World War II. Also, we have traveled way more on average than all of the other generations due to how open Russia has been during our time, and we are more likely to know English at some basic level. My brother's generation is known by older people as the one corrupted by Western trash, stuff like porn, junk food, alcohol, and tobacco that was previously heavily regulated by the Soviet Union. My mom's generation is remembered as the freest one in the Soviet Union, as you could make jokes about Brezhnev and not be sent to the gulag, which was nice. Russians of that generation, however, also ended up being in their 40s around the 90s. This was problematic because they still had a decade till retirement, and all of a sudden the country radically changed. This led to a massive spike in people who are nostalgic for the predictability of the Soviet Union, which you can observe in politicians like Putin and Lukashenko. They also think within the paradigm of the Cold War because of their nostalgia. My South African friends, meanwhile, said that in their country, they obviously distinguish between the generations that grew up under the apartheid regime versus those who didn't, with blacks born after the fall of apartheid known as the born free generation. My South African friend Prince says, I'm a semi-born free from South Africa, born just before democracy in 1992 and Mandela being president in 94. I went to white schools my entire childhood and have a university education, but still still had connections to location / the hood, as they would call it. Location in this context, I believe, is the South African slang for like a poor black area. I grew up in a very South Africa-centric, post-apartheid, Rainbow Nation bullshit time, where we were exposed to a lot of unique South African pop culture, like Kwaito, Generations, Brenda Fassie, and Hansi Cronje. At the same time, DSTV and the internet brought a lot of exposure to the Western world as well, including MTV, pop music, hip-hop, Hollywood, and the like. I think a lot of South Africans born from 1985 to 1994 can relate. My white friend Drew, meanwhile, says, "My dad grew up under apartheid and admitted that during his childhood he was extremely racist. He always feels quite self-conscious about not appearing racist now because he feels awful about how distorted his worldview was. He still has a good relationship with his parents and they aren't discriminatory, and in that way it feels lucky because there are a fair number of people who do feel uncomfortable with the things that their relatives might say or do." I must say, I really enjoyed a lot of these anecdotes that you guys shared about your parents. My friend Santi from Mexico had this to say about their parents. "As a Mexican, I love the generational contrast that both my mom and dad represent. My dad, born 1958, grew up in a small rural town with 9 siblings and had to work from the age of 8. He was lucky enough to get a full education during the years in which the Mexican state was really repressive towards students, and was part of the generation that was in their peak years of adulthood when Mexico made its shift from a heavily protectionist economy towards a more globalized one. I think all of these factors shaped his mostly hardworking, pain-enduring personality and heavy distrust towards authority. My mom, born in 1970, on the other hand, was from a lower middle-class family, a product of the rapid urbanization and population growth of Mexico City. She was among the first generations of women that, instead of staying at home doing chores, decided to pursue a career. She also grew up among all of this 80s and 90s pop culture stuff that called for younger folks to have fun and do their own thing. And that's why she's got a more independent nature and loves to go out and live new experiences. Now, in the first video, I talked about how I was born in 1984, which by most metrics makes me an older millennial. But according to some charts, I am actually an Xennial, or part of a culturally distinct transitional generation between Gen Xers and millennials, both of whom I can sort of relate to. This idea of transitional generations provoked a lot of commentary, which is perhaps unsurprising since, according to my YouTube demographics, the largest segment of my audience consists of 18 to 24-year-olds, which is to say people born right at the transition point between millennials and Zoomers. Apparently, there has been some effort to make the term Zillennial a thing, as sort of the modern follow-up to Xennials. My friend Jordy had this to say: "Being from 2002, hearing people talk about categories like millennials and Gen Z is such nonsense. No, I don't get all of your 90s references, let alone 80s ones, but I also absolutely do not relate to 12-year-olds. In the just 7 years that separate these two groups, so much has happened and so many things have changed so quickly, it's crazy." Charles adds, "I definitely think people are more nuanced than the generational archetypes. Me, for instance. I was born in 2001 and the internet has shaped my life in a way, but I feel more connected to Gen X, my parents' generation, than my own. I have the same music taste as my dad and similar political beliefs to him. I don't use many of the big social medias like Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, etc., but I'm still very plugged into meme culture and watch YouTube regularly." DDub04, however, has a rebuttal. "I think the transitional names are really stupid because it's trying to ascribe a unique identity to someone that just had a slightly different experience from other people. You could do that for every birth year if you wanted to get technical. In some countries, however, the divide between Zoomers and millennials is pretty stark indeed. My friend Nestor from Greece says, "There is a huge divide between millennials and Zoomers here, as millennials were used to the high life and reckless spending of the pre-2008 economic crisis period, while we Zoomers have only known austerity. This has led to a romanticization and memification of 1990s and 2000s Greece as this golden era under the rule of the PASOK party. Common jokes today include the COVID-inspired 'if PASOK was still in charge, you'd get fined if you stayed home on the weekend,' or 'in PASOK's time, people didn't even know what color the €5 note was. PASOK's anthem can even be heard in parties and nightclubs." According to my friend Arco, meanwhile, in India, millennials don't even exist. At least not in the sense that Westerners would recognize. Generations in India are not really analogous to generations in European majority countries. Baby boomers in India are most similar to the generation of Europeans who fought in the Second World War. Gen Xers in India are split between people who were born between 1965 and 1975, and the ones born between 1975 and 1985. The first cohort is very similar to the generation that came before them, while the other is more similar to what we think of when we talk about boomers. Millennials in India, meanwhile, are very similar to Gen X folk in the West. We are the last generation of kids who got regular beatings in home and in school. We're the last generation of kids who experienced life before the internet. Zoomers in India, however, are identical to their Western counterparts. Basically, millennials as a generation don't exist in India. One comment I made in the previous video that seems to have captivated a lot of you is this idea of family size being one of the key distinguishing features between generations, with our parents' and grandparents' generation all having enormous amounts of siblings and in-laws and things compared to us. Juan says, "Yes, I live in Colombia and my family meetings are full of cousins." And I can't emphasize the full enough. You'd have to witness it, and that's just from one part of my father's side. Daniel says, "I'm Irish. My father has 12 siblings. I have one." In response to my comment that smaller family sizes may lead to less family drama, my friend Justin writes this: "The idea that the younger generations are less likely to experience family drama is perhaps overlooking a big generational trend of the boomers, high divorce rates. For millennials and zoomers, it is true that they have fewer siblings, but they also frequently have step-siblings and half-siblings. I'd argue that provides its own unique and often more intense form of family drama. And often statistics on the number of children don't show the full picture because they ignore those webs of interconnected split families." My friend Jaceladag, meanwhile, adds, "On the family drama thing, here in Guatemala, we do see a sharp decline in inter-family conflict after the 1980s, but not exactly because of decreasing family sizes. A very peculiar thing that happened in the early 80s is that the military dictator running the country at the time was a very devout evangelical and anti-communist who wanted to bring down the Catholic Church because of its many leftist preachers. As a result, he sponsored many conversion efforts from American evangelical preachers, resulting in a dramatic increase in the number of Protestant Christians, going from 5% to 45%. He didn't stay in power very long, and nowadays is remembered more for committing war crimes against the indigenous population, but I think his effect on Protestant conversions is just as significant. My mom's entire generation was scarred by the experience of families fracturing along sectarian lines, and in an effort to prevent that from happening again, there is now a lot of cultural emphasis on sheltering people from outside religious ideas and not rocking the boat in the family too much. The concept of generational trauma, which I spoke about a bit, also provoked a fair amount of discussion. This is the idea that if a particular generation is associated with something uniquely bad, this can cause dysfunctions to permeate the culture in various ways. I mentioned the idea of boomer-aged Germans having fairly troubled relationships with their Nazi parents as an example. My German friend VikingLord responds, "That generational trauma you mentioned about Germany is definitely a thing as far as I can tell. Sometimes when speaking about my deceased grandfather, born in 1928, the question of whether or not we can consider him a Nazi comes up, and my mother, born in 1959, literally can't give an answer. She seems A, actually clueless, but B, also like she's actively trying to avoid thinking too much about this topic. To be clear though, this must be a very hard situation, and I perfectly understand the trauma that you mentioned. Learning about the Holocaust and the like while having fond memories of your dad who was around when these things happened must be a very frustrating thing." He adds that, "In the late 60s, a movement of leftist university students started questioning the apparent non-guilt of their parents' generation, which led to more open discussion of the topic among the public. This was what happened in the streets, however, and I believe that in many family homes, things went on as before." And talking of the Holocaust, it will of course not be surprising to learn that theories of generational trauma are very present in the Jewish community. My Israeli friend The Gamers says, "In Israel, we kind of have that generational trauma with Holocaust survivors. The kids of the survivors are called the second generation, and they talk about the distance between them and their parents, the fact that you couldn't throw away food no matter what, and the constant existential fear that resulted in the unique way it shaped their lives and the way they developed their relationships, etc. My friend Muk Koch has an even more disturbing perspective. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and I still have some inherited elements of it. All of their parents were murdered when they were quite young, and they had no model of parenting behavior, so when they raised my parents, they didn't really do normal things like hugging their children because they were never hugged. My parents modeled after their parents and raised me in a similarly odd way. I'm kind of hoping to break the chain of neurosis. My friend Jacob, meanwhile, brings up a completely different genocide. A great example of generational trauma you didn't mention would be in Cambodia. I've heard it said that you see the very elderly and you see the young, but it's rare to see people in the age group 55 to 75, and these people are heavily distrusted and disliked by the rest of society. These are the people that would have been young adults during the genocide, so the logic goes, if they're still around, they may have collaborated with Pol Pot's regime. A bunch of you also noted that a growing number of scientists believe generational trauma might actually have a biological component through what is known as epigenetic inheritance. This is when some sort of disease or disorder is passed on hereditarily, but not through mutated genes, which is usually the case. But that said, this particular school of biology is in a very early and often unpersuasive stage. As this 2018 story from the New York Times concludes, for now, and for many scientists, the research in epigenetics falls well short of demonstrating that past human cruelties affect our physiology today in any predictable or consistent way. Which isn't to say that generational trauma isn't real, it just might not be biological. So, thanks so much to everybody who contributed all of these wonderful anecdotes this week. I love making videos like these, not only because I have to do a lot less writing, but also because you guys always clearly put a lot of effort into trying to share interesting and insightful reflections on the issues I raise. If you're still hungry for even more stories and reflections on the topic of generations, be sure to check out last week's comments, which contain far more than I could ever hope to cram into one measly follow-up video. Do you have a good idea for a broad cultural topic I should make a video about in the future? Let me know in the comments of this one, and I will see you next week.